So, a new Battlefield game was revealed, along with some concept art and an interview with Vince Zampella, who I'm not exactly sure what his role in this game is, but it seems to be, pretty high up role. And if that name sounds familiar to you, Vince Zampella is the head of Respawn. He often gets credit for Modern Warfare 2 being as good as it is, and he has a good track record of making decent games. He's not one of those developers that has a ton of flops under their belt and somehow still has a career. He actually has decent games under his belt, so that's good. And so now this headline says it confirms the next Battlefield will use modern setting, which again, good news. We're getting good news here. We have an industry veteran who makes good games and a modern setting, which is something that players of Battlefield have been wanting for like a decade at this point. And so along with that, there was this cover art, which, some decently interesting concept art. But so yeah, IGN got this article that it's like part article on the reveal and part interview with Vince Zampella. And he says some interesting stuff here in this interview. Some of it good, but some of it also a little concerning. For instance, when it comes to good stuff, Zampella says, if you look back to the peak or the pinnacle of Battlefield, it's that Battlefield 3, Battlefield 4 era where everything was modern. And I think we have to get back to the core of what Battlefield is and do that amazingly well. And then we'll see where it goes from there. But I think for me, it's that peak of Battlefieldness is in that Battlefield 3 and 4 days. So I think it's nostalgic for players, for me, for the teams even. Those are kind of the heyday. Although I would say 1942 also, which yeah, that's a very good sign because that is when the series was kind of at its best. I would even add, Bad Company and maybe even Battlefield 1 into that. But obviously I think Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4 are the ones that it makes the most sense to kind of learn from in this moment. Battlefield 1 was kind of like a different direction, kind of like a one-off, and the Bad Company series was more console oriented, whereas this is going to be all platforms. So the concerning thing is that it's taken them over a decade to realize this. And it seems like had it not been for Vince Zampella here, that may not have happened. It almost seems like it was his idea to go in this direction, which is a good sign that he wants that, but it's also a bad sign that everybody else working on the game didn't seem to have this idea before. It's like they should have had this idea the second Battlefield 5 didn't perform the way they wanted it to. They should have had this idea after people started getting tired of Battlefield 1, really, like in the time between Battlefield 1 and the Battlefield 5 reveal, where it's like, yeah, people were having fun with Battlefield 1 at first, but over time it kind of gets stale. And so then people were going back to Battlefield 4. It's like that should have been a sign that, that's what people want. They want a modern setting. Even like the near future setting of Battlefield 2042 could have been fine had they not just messed that game up in a ton of different ways. But I think modern setting is the best bet. He also says a few other promising things like, yeah, the 128 player didn't make it more fun. Like doing the number for the sake of the number doesn't make any sense. We're testing everything around what's the most fun. That's very important. So like you said, the maps, once they get to a certain scale, become different. It's a different play space, and I think you have to design around that. So we're designing something that is more akin to previous Battlefields. Now this is a great sign. The 128 player count was a horrible idea, and this is something that I've been talking about for a long time. Going back to when I was a kid, adding more players does not make the game better, and if anything, it causes more problems. Take a look at the game Mag. Mag had up to I think it's 256 players and a lobby, and the problem is that would create portions of the map that were just way too chaotic and portions of the map that were just way too empty. And a lot of times you'd have to walk all the way across the portions of the map that were empty, taking several minutes of your time doing nothing to get to the parts that are way too chaotic, and then you just die instantly, not really knowing what's going on. And then the only alternative to that is something like Operation Metro with 64 players, where it's just entirely chaotic like the whole time because everything's all contained in a tiny area, which can be fun every now and then, but I would not want an entire game like that. That would not be appealing at all. And if you look at the maps that I think were the best overall, personally, I think maps like Sharkey Peninsula or Strike at Karkand or Erica Harbor, where you have a variety of environments, but also the environments kind of steer you in certain directions. It has a lot of space for vehicles, but it also doesn't have this massive open space for people to basically get lost and wandering and just cutting down on the player count, making people hard to find, or also having people way too concentrated in a small urban area. Sharkey Peninsula is very well balanced, I feel like. Which, real quick, let me know in the comments below what your favorite Battlefield map is. I'd be interested to hear that. It's kind of a weird pick, but I would probably say Sharkey Peninsula. I don't know what it is about that map in particular I've just always really liked, but there is plenty of other good maps to talk about. Those are just kind of the first that popped into my head. But it is good news that it seems like they're going to focus more on maps like I'm talking about than just these wide open, empty maps built for way too many players. So talking about specialists, he says, so I wasn't there for 2042, which I think is kind of funny. It's kind of like he's distancing himself from this. He says, I don't know what the rationale was, but for me, It's like the team tried something new. You have to applaud that effort. Not everybody liked it, but you gotta try things. Which, yeah, you gotta try things, but I feel like you need to test things after you try them, rather than just, you know, trying to sell something that you don't know if it works or not. And that's the thing, is it didn't work. It didn't fit. Specialists will not be coming back. Good news. So classes are kind of at the core of Battlefield, duh, and we're going back to that. But he follows that with something that I find a little concerning, which is he's careful to stress that Battlefield 2042 wasn't a failure of a game, despite not doing as well as hoped. Now, I get that they might not want to admit this publicly, because, you know, maybe it's not the best for business, but Battlefield 2042 was absolutely a failure. It might not have been like the biggest financial failure, thanks to things like microtransactions, but it absolutely was a failure in terms of the longevity of the series. If this next Battlefield game is a flop, the series is done. I cannot see it coming back, at least not anytime soon. If it comes back, it'll be like somebody trying to bring back a lost relic. And even as the EA doesn't want a repeat of the experience it had with 2042, we want it to be good out of the gate, which that's a good sign. You know, games should launch good. It shouldn't even be a thing that these games are launching like unfinished, almost unplayable. It's just ridiculous. So it is kind of like a bare minimum, but it is good news that he's saying that. Another thing that I find a little concerning is that they mentioned that there's 4 studios working on the game: DICE, Motive, Ripple Effect, and Criterion. So DICE is the main studio that works on Battlefield. I don't know much about Motive. Ripple Effect has been like kind of like a support studio for Battlefield in recent years, which is a little concerning because they've mostly worked on the not very good Battlefield games. And Criterion is very concerning for me because they've made a lot of bad games in recent years. They're the studio that made, you know, many of the great Burnout games that, you know, were great. But since then, you know, they've made games like the Most Wanted reboot, which I think is terrible. And then they've worked on, you know, the Battlefield games. And it's just like, that's a very bad sign that not only have they worked on some of the worst Battlefield games, but they also made Need for Speed Most Wanted, which might be one of the worst Need for Speed games. How you make games that mess up something, which this is something I talk about a lot, is these series, these great series, have obvious blueprints. Don't mess up the blueprint and you have a good game, like pretty much a guaranteed good game. And somehow Criterion has messed up the blueprint for 2 different series. That's very concerning. It's also concerning to see several studios work on one game because a lot of times, you know, they'll be disjointed, not exactly on the same page. And it also means that there's going to be a much bigger budget on this, which means that they're going to double down on stuff like microtransactions. And it's just concerning to me for a variety of reasons. But yeah, going on, you know, then they start comparing it to Call of Duty, which that's another thing I want to talk about, is Modern Warfare 2019 took so many of the good aspects about Battlefield. Just like very obviously took them, you know, and it was during a time when it's like Battlefield wasn't even paying attention to what made Battlefield good, and Call of Duty, you know, just took a little bit of time to take inspiration from the successful Battlefield games, you know, see what works and what doesn't in their game, and it ended up being like their most successful title in a long time. And it's kind of insane that Battlefield didn't see that and be like, oh, that's what we should have been doing. But yeah, I mean, obviously Call of Duty didn't like perfectly replicate the Battlefield formula. They got pretty close with like the ground war mode, but I think it was largely lacking in decent vehicle combat. There was vehicle combat, I just don't think it was decent, and there wasn't like the classes like engineer and all that. But they got very, very close, which is really interesting and a very bad look for Battlefield, considering that Call of Duty was like closer to Battlefield than Battlefield. I mean, and then you also have BattleBit. That's a whole other deal. It's just like the fact that other people were doing Battlefield better than the makers of Battlefield for several years was insane. But yeah, the rest of this article is just kind of like random stuff. They're talking about like, are they gonna have like some tie-in series to like a TV show or something? And Zampella's obviously like, no, that's stupid. I mean, it doesn't say that, but it is stupid. And the fact that somebody at IGN asked him that is a little concerning to me. Like, no, that shouldn't be a thing at all. Like, you shouldn't even consider that. Why would you consider that? Just stop that nonsense. Stop. And then, you know, stuff about like what platforms it's going to be on. But so basically there's a lot of promising information about this, but I obviously won't be sold until I actually like play a beta, probably, because especially with the disasters of Battlefield 5 and Battlefield 2042, I think we all need to be very, very skeptical of this. You know, especially with Battlefield 2042, they were basically advertising it in a very similar way at first, where they're like, yeah, we learned from our mistakes and, you know, we're going to correct those. And they obviously didn't. They didn't even come close. they somehow made it worse than Battlefield 5. Battlefield 2042 is worse than Battlefield 5. And that's insane because Battlefield 5 was a disaster for them. The fact that you had to have 2 disasters like that in a row is insane to me. Absolutely insane. Especially when, again, the blueprint is obvious. And luckily, Vince Zampella here seems to realize that. But, I mean, are these studios completely different people? Like, have they completely replaced the people in the studios? Probably not. So we're largely going to be getting people who thought Battlefield 5 and Battlefield 2042 were decent products. And they obviously knew what people wanted the whole time. Like, because the way they were advertising Battlefield 2042, I feel like a lot of people may forget this, but people were very excited about the advertising for Battlefield 2042. Like, people thought that they were going in the right direction. I feel like I was the only person who was pointing out that they were basically relying entirely on gimmicks to advertise the product, like the tornadoes and stuff like that. And it's like, random gimmicks like that aren't what make the series good. That's just something that, could be interesting, but shouldn't be necessary to the game to make the game interesting. And if you really feel the need to highlight it, I feel like there's something wrong. And so, when we see advertisements, I do think that's something you need to look out for is, are they focusing on gameplay or are they focusing on gimmicks? If they're focusing on gimmicks, it's a horrible sign. We're probably going to need to stay away from it. But yeah, what do you think? Do you think this game's going to turn out well, or are you skeptical? Or maybe a bit of both? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit the like button. And if you want to see more from me, subscribe. That's it for today, so yeah.
That's what we should have been doing.